Where is former Agent Thomas?
We're not sure. It's been 11 months since his suspension.
He was cleared of those charges.
Right. Nevertheless, he resigned from the agency shortly after and basically disappeared. Probably passed out in some gutter.
Unlikely. A man like that doesn't just lie down quietly. Okay. Let's find Mr. Thomas and bring him in.
Recognizing their success with the critically acclaimed horror game Condemned Criminal Origins, Sega was nice enough to foot the bill for Monolith's inevitable sequel to one of the scariest games released this generation. Condemned 2 Bloodshot offers to both continue the brutal, freakish gameplay we all enjoyed from the first Condemned, and to further explain some of the plot lines that left the first game's story a little too obscure for its own good. The real question is whether the gameplay additions and explanations offered in the sequel are satisfactory enough to do the first game justice.
Get out!
Once again, players are placed in the role of balls-nasty federal detective Ethan Thomas, who's been disillusioned with his employer, the Special Crimes Unit, and turned to heavy drinking as a result of the first game's events. After his friend Malcolm Van Horn goes missing under unusual circumstances, however, the SCU director enlists the help of Ethan's former associate, Angel Rosa, to help track down Ethan and convince him to help with the investigation. After reluctantly accepting, Ethan is thrown back into circulation, raiding squatter-infested slums and analyzing evidence-ridden crime scenes. As the story continues, more plotlines are introduced, other characters from the first game make a return appearance, and Ethan eventually discovers that the so-called investigation might be a cover for something much bigger beneath the surface. The good news is that the story is still told through both cutscenes and in-game forensic analysis, and the disturbing psychological hallucinations from the first game are just as effective here, with the grotesquerie getting a facelift to make it much more disturbing this time.
Van Horn? What are you... Oh!
If you never played the first game, know that the Condemned series built its name on unsettling levels of brutality and violence, which are portrayed in some of the most horrifying ways. It's one of the most effective takes on the horror genre we've ever seen, and the sequel has been built with new players in mind, so you don't need to play the first game in order to understand this one. Just know that it's not for the faint of heart. If you're a fan of horror flicks or cheap thrills, however, you'll be right at home. The first Condemned was unlike anything we'd ever seen because of the relentless first-person view linked to an impressive melee combat system, and Bloodshot holds true to that same satisfying skull-cracking with a few new additions. You can pick up almost anything you could ever dream of killing someone with and proceed to whack people in the head until they stop moving. Blocking is even more important than it was in the first game, and most everything works just as well as it did the first time around. This highly effective combat system is in stark contrast to more gun-based survival horror games, in which the player is almost certainly doomed if he or she runs out of ammunition. Bringing an enemy to their knees still allows you to perform some vicious finisher moves, except this time the finishers allow you to be a little more creative and utilize the environment to finish off an enemy with some wicked style. Guns are still available from time to time, except this time you can actually reload if you find another gun of the exact same caliber. And some levels have a more shooter-oriented design, which in many ways disgraces the game's reputation. New additions include the hand-to-hand fighting system, complete with combos, the ability to throw weapons at enemies, and weapon condition, which limits each weapon to a certain amount of hits or blocks, causing them to break after a short time.
Receiving image. Good work.
The cool thing about the forensic investigations in Condemned 2 is that they still serve to tell the story, but you actually have a direct choice in how you investigate everything this time. Each crime scene is yours to decipher. You have to decide which forensic tool to use, how to use it, and you must further decide how to best analyze each piece of evidence you find. You're scored on how well you investigate each crime scene, and even awarded upgrades based on how good of a detective you are. Let's face it, Not everyone's a Gil Grissom or Horatio Kane, so you can certainly get through the game with the lowest possible score on each crime scene, but it's still nice that Monolith decided to further involve the player in the investigations this time.
Receiving evidence now.
The gripping sense of atmospheric terror is still ever present, keeping you nervous and uncomfortable at all times. The levels are still linear, dark, claustrophobic, and decaying urban environments infested with homicidal psychos just dying to bash your brains out. Some of the levels do change things up, however, being less dark and decaying, but just as claustrophobic, like one that takes place in a medieval museum exhibit, and another set in a snowblind cabin in the forest. Imagine if Fatal Frame, Silent Hill, or Resident Evil had a competitive multiplayer mode. Sounds weird, doesn't it? That's about how you'll feel as a fan of the Condemned series when playing the Versus modes in Condemned 2. It actually gets a little more strange because some of the modes are quite deep, but the unusual feel of the combat system online goes to show how out of place the idea really is. It's easy to respect what Monolith was trying to do here, but competitive modes in a Condemned game just don't fit into the style or design of the series as a concept. The new additions to the gameplay in Condemned 2 work pretty well, adding more depth to both the combat and puzzle solving. Some of the story element, with conspiracies and science fiction, might be a little unsatisfying to fans, but the refined gameplay is enough to hold anyone's interest during an average 8-hour playthrough. If you enjoyed the first game, do not hesitate to pick up this one. If you've never experienced a Condemned game before, be warned of the gameplay's graphic nature, but also know that Condemned 2 Bloodshot is psychologically disturbing and effectively terrifying beyond almost anything we've seen, and that in itself is reason enough to give it a chance.
My name is Ethan Thomas. I work for the Serial Crimes Unit. And the blood on my hands ain't never washing off. They said my drinking was an issue. They said I left one too many bodies and one too many alleys. But everybody in this unit knows why they really brought me back.
Send me a picture of the body.
Because the rest of these jerks are too friggin' scared of getting killed.
Drop it!
And that just ain't gonna get the job done. When a guy like me is your only hope, you got a big problem. And no one on God's green earth is gonna like the way I solve it.